Hello and welcome to another video. So this is another one in the series where I take a look at games that I have worked on and talk a bit about some of the technical aspects, also some of the design aspects, and share a bunch of the code for it. So in this case, the game that taking a look at is one called Through My Window. This was one that was made at the early stages of the pandemic. Good friend organized a game jam called I think it was the Together Alone game jam, because that was the early stages where we were, all of us were, like a lot of us were working from home, things like that. And so the idea was to be making a bunch of games and sharing them, and we're working on them separately. So that was kind of the theme of what we're going for with it. And this was a game I made for it. So I'm using a fairly old version of Unity for loading this. The reason for that is just because there is a lot of, this was built in quite an old version, and it was not going to necessarily convert well. So the idea behind the game is this one's actually pretty much intended as a kind of a screensaver. So you get assigned to a random apartment and you actually can look around. You can't move. You can turn your light off and on, and different events happen. You'll see at times cars go by, times there can be thunderstorms that happen. Some of the buildings, the lights on them will actually change in particular sort of sequences. And sometimes there might be things like, flyers or other stuff like that happens. So there's a few different sort of things that can happen there in it. But the actual sort of key aspect of it, if I stop it and go back to start, is this actually has an online mode. So as well as being effectively a screensaver sort of thing, it's one that is actually has essentially a shared world. I kind of mostly jokingly but half seriously referred to it as an MMO screensaver, because in the online mode, you're assigned to a unique apartment in the building. And if there are other people in the world at that point in time, then when you change your light, their light will also change as well. So in this case, I've been assigned to a particular building, and a different one from before. So right now, I'm actually connected to the server. So if there were other people playing this, very unlikely given the age of the game and given it's kind of just a sit in the background type of game. If they change their lights, then myself and anyone else connected would see that. So you had this limited ability to communicate, but there was this sort of shared experience. So you could be together in this world, but you're also isolated in your own apartment. So that was kind of the theme for it. And it was a lot of fun making, sort of server side and aspects like of that. And that's, I'm going to share a bunch of the code related to this. So in terms of the things I want to talk about with this is, from a design point of view, I wanted this, there's nothing that you need to do. It's just very chill, very relaxed. But there are things that can happen. So if we take a look at our actual level here, we have a bunch of managers, and the main big one is this gameplay event manager. And we've got this series of different events that can happen. So this was something that I set up. So there's different light shows that can happen, which those we actually have, it can pick a building and it will go and make the lights will change so that it's showing, a heart. Other ones will change to be showing high. So we've got a few different things like of that can happen. And these were for the buildings on the left and the right. So if I go to the scene view, we have the actual main building. Oops. Go and take a look at the world. So we've got our main buildings either side here, and then we have these sort of secondary buildings, which the idea is those secondary ones. Those can actually have the lights changed when someone gets assigned to an apartment. It's never one in there. It's only ever one of the ones in this side or in this side. So that's sort of a key part of it. So there was the light shows. I have a bunch of emitters and things like of that for thunder that can happen. So it would, you'd get flashes of light, you get the audio for it. There's vehicles that can move around. So we've got these tracks laid out that various vehicles can follow. That's just using the dolly tracks system that's available. So if I take a look at the car tracks, so it's just using these Cinemachine smooth paths, and it has these carts that move along them, which those carts have, if I find one of them, yep. So they've just got different vehicles, and those vehicles just move around at, again, a fairly sort of slow rate. And if I go back to the scene view, there's a challenge with this. So go back to scene view. You can see they're just slowly moving around. Didn't want the vehicles to be moving rapidly. Again, everything from a design point of view, intentionally, it's slow, steady changes that happen. So there's those different events. There is the poster one, where there is a track that it moves down. The actual poster itself is we'll be able to see it here if I bring up the prefab for it in the scene view. This is actually a real poster that the building I was in, this poster actually got sort of sent around. I think it was put in front of everyone's doors or in everyone's letterboxes. I can't remember. But this got put around, and this is actually a scan and an exact copy of that poster where they tried to organize everyone singing YMCA at 8 p.m. I don't know if I was not on the side of building that it was, the person was on, but it kind of didn't really happen, which was not really surprising. At the timing of this, everyone was just really not in the mood for sort of celebrating, but it was a really cool idea, and I wanted to kind of commemorate that. I think I still have a copy of the poster as well. It's one of those things that I'm pretty sure I kept it because I didn't want to throw something like that out, because it was just kind of a nice little cool sort of element, a thing that someone was trying to do in the midst of all of what that period was. So the gameplay event manager is coordinating all of this stuff, and this is probably a good one to take a bit of a look at, because one of the things that I wanted to do with this was I wanted it to be randomized in terms of what stuff would happen. But what I also wanted was, if multiple people, even if they were playing offline mode, if you were playing that, then you would get the same experiences at the same times, assuming your, clock that you were on the computer you were running in was sort of properly in sync with your sort of time zone. So you didn't need to be in the same time zones, your clock needed to be accurate for where you were, and then it didn't matter what time zone you were in the world. So there was a lot of stuff that I was doing where it was keeping track of the UTC time. So it's a time where, right now, any different time zone in the world, if you looked at the UTC time, it would actually be exactly the same. So it gave me something that, again, could allow people to be coordinated, at least in time, no matter where they were in the world or what time zone they were in the world. So I kept track of all of this, so keeping track of sort of that UTC time. And that was sort of a big aspect for it. The actual events themselves, so not much to their interface, but the actual configuration in that for them sort of was the bigger aspect. And if we take a look at the what the data for some of these looks like, so when it was configured, could control permitted hours that it would happen in, but I generally, what it would do is it would, okay, it's randomized, but here's the UTC minutes that it happens between. The random seed, I could control what different things were included with it, and I threw in just an additional number as a modifier. So all of these follow sort of a similar pattern, but things like the poster, for example, could only happen if it was a Wednesday in UTC time. And that was an intentional thing because I wanted it to be a case of, it was an actual Wednesday that this person was trying to organize this on. So I wanted that to be when the event was actually happening. So all of these pretty similar in terms of the way those modes worked. And even down to things like the thunder was tied to UTC time. And all of that was so that everything could be happening consistently. Because what it would do is this random seed function, I would take our UTC time, and depending upon what things were included, I would then include those particular elements. So I didn't allow minutes to be a thing that was included, only stuff that was likely to be, changing at a fairly slow rate. I didn't want minutes because if someone's local clock was a bit out, then that could make throw things off a bit too much. And this was enough variation. I wanted some variation, so some randomness, but I didn't want too much. So that's why I heavily sort of restricted the number of sort of elements included here. So what you'll see is I am regularly seeding the random number generator. So any case where I'm actually doing a random, I make sure I have seeded the generator beforehand. So you'll see that with all of these different ones, when it activates, getting delays, all of these different ones, it seeds the random number generator with this consistent calculation. So again, this is something where that could be a useful thing if you're wanting to have a game where you might not want actual multiplayer, but you might want it to be a case of there's similar things happening for people at similar points in time. So that worked quite nicely. The actual logic here, not really too much to it. And even the particular events, there wasn't really a lot to them. The light show one needed to split up those patterns. So I had back here under the light shows, I defined these patterns which corresponded to which apartments the lights were on. So I needed to split those bits of information out, but was relatively straightforward. So it would still go through and apply those. Those would happen over a little bit of time. So there was a bit of an apply time and a hold time. The poster event, very little to it. So a lot of these had very little logic that they needed to do. Thunder had a little bit more, it was playing audio. So I was using WWise for this. It's my standard go-to for all of these. So that worked really nicely. I'd vary the intensity. Some of these things, I would more do them with timeline these days rather than necessarily hooking it up as manually as I did in this case. So that's something that I would change in future ones. The vehicles had audio. Again, not really a lot that they needed to be doing. It's just starting and stopping engines, and the vehicle event had very little to do. So a lot of the logic there's not too much to it. Where actually more of the logic was, and where sort of one of the main things was actually the logic for the connecting. So this is one where I will make this and the other files I showed available. There will be one change that I do make to this, and that is going to be, there is a variable which I have hidden behind a region here. That variable has the specific URL to the server where it was going and performing the particular logic. I'm not going to make that URL available because obviously potential, issues there of people spamming this, things like that. Now, admittedly, yes, someone could very easily reverse engineer the executable and figure that out. But I don't want to, have it that by default the server is getting spammed. So with this pretty sort of straightforward connection process, it follows having a state machine for it. I do recommend any case where you have a system where you are connecting, you're logging into something, and where you have a clear sort of logic flow that has to happen. Using discrete states like this is a very good way of doing that and ensuring robustness. Like state machines for AIs, a valid criticism of them is that they can tend to be too rigid, but this is one of those cases where that rigidity is actually what we want. So it's actually really handy in a case like of this. So a lot of what this was doing, there was general stuff here for an update. So the way this was structured of how the system works is it would obtain a lease to a place, and it would then periodically renew that. The reason I adopted that approach was so that on the server side, if a lease was more than, I think I went for something like twice the renewal interval old, that lease would be released. It's just so that if someone disconnected, if internet crashed, it might not get to send a disconnect event. So in that case, it was able to, the server could clean up and you didn't get stale connections. So it would try and do that. It would also periodically run a sync. And it did have different paths depending upon whether we were online or offline. So the main difference between these two, if we look at the offline one first, so it has this update lights for the randomized buildings. Those were the two ones to the side that you never get an apartment in. So both of them do that. But the big thing that changes is when I get the light information, and this is using the older web request system, when I get the light information, what I have to do is then, deconstruct all of that, and that goes and updates the particular apartments. Whereas for the offline one, what it would actually do is randomize things. How that was randomized was based upon particular information about the building. And that would just randomize the apartment lights. So in an offline mode, you would still get lights changing in those randomized buildings. It's just that they would not be, it wasn't syncing the lights for the main buildings. So that worked quite nicely. And this would randomize the lights in those leasable buildings is the key thing there. So in terms of the other core bits of logic of how it would work is, okay, that's sort of what's happening with update. We're doing those sync bits of logic. And then what we would be doing here is, whether it's online or offline, or similar logic there with the UI, but it would just go and as we're doing a beginning, it would be doing this animating. This animating takes a lot longer than it does to actually form a connection. The connection is actually activated pretty rapidly. The reason there is this delay is, again, The game was about a slow, chill feel. That's why when you connect, it has that slow fade in of the different bits of text, that slow animation that happens there, because I didn't want to have really rapid anything happening in it. Everything was intended to just be, this is just chill. So there was the UI animation logic. Again, this is something where if I was doing this again, I would do all of that in timeline. Like every single bit of it, I would do in timeline. This was the main sort of state machine, so we could keep track of stuff. Again, a lot of these had online or offline versions. So for selecting an apartment, in the offline one, it was randomized. But again, randomized, in this case, using things that are more likely to be different between people, like the milliseconds, but also something that's likely to be similar. So it was using a mix there. But it would just pick a random leasable building and a random apartment. Online mode, what would happen is we'd send a request for a lease, and the server would get back to us, and it would tell us which building we are in and which apartment we are actually in. So the server was managing that. Now the server wouldn't just go through and give you apartments in order. It was also doing a little bit of randomization as well. But it made sure that what it picked was unique. So that was sort of a key part of it. So it would pick the building and select that, and then if at that point we failed and it was not able to go online, we just actually would fall back to the offline mode. Again, one of these key things with all of this was I didn't want people to I wanted no friction with this as much as possible. So if it failed to connect online, you wouldn't get, an error bounce back or anything like of that. All you would get is you actually just go into offline mode. And largely that fact is hidden from you, just to keep everything chill. So, fairly straightforward. If we change the lights, it would send notification to the server with the light change when we were renewing a lease. So this is a fairly similar process I've followed for quite a few games that I've done that have had a sort of server side to them. It's good for very simple server-side ones. If you're doing something more complex, this wouldn't quite cut it. But for very simple ones, this approach works fine. Selecting the apartments, all of that logic we've looked at. Randomizing the lights, we've seen as well. And that's pretty much it for the actual logic for the game. There was really not a lot to it intentionally. Most of the work went into getting those server communications working, getting stuff happening in terms of that feeding back through so you were able to see those changes, and making it so that the server can handle having quite a lot of people, which it can actually handle quite a lot of ones. I think there's a lot of sort of clusters. So it will always allocate people to, the earliest cluster that's free. But if that cluster gets full, then it will go and actually allocate from a different cluster. So you can see randomized, so I'm in a different building this time. So that was the key things to it. In terms of other sort of visual elements, one of the things you might wonder about is the rain shader here. The rain shader is one that I absolutely cannot take credit for. This is one where I'm not going to share the code for it, but I will in the description link to videos from The Art of Code. That's where this shader came from. If you are interested in even the slightest way in shaders, I very, 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 very strongly recommend checking out the stuff from The Art of Code. His tutorials are phenomenally good, and the stuff just looks awesome. Like, I love how good this rain shader looks. There's a lot of flexibility and controls with it. It's just It's cool. And it was one of those things where the feel of the game really came through once I had that shader in there. So I'm not going to directly share the code for it, but I am going to link you to the tutorials for it. So yes, if you're interested in learning about the rain shader, or if you were interested in learning about shaders in general, check out the stuff from the art of code. It is just so good. Explains stuff really well, and his stuff just looks awesome. So I do recommend checking that out. So I am going to make a bunch of the code for this available. All of the code that you saw me working with here, all of these I will make available. The thing with this is that code won't necessarily all run, because there are going to be dependencies on some things that I can't include because of licenses. And there are going to be some things that I have to comment out, like the server URL and things like of that. I haven't gone into the server code with this. The reason being is that honestly, that server code is functional, but the server code is also several years old. And unlike this C# code that not too much has changed, we would need to be updated for using it with a modern Unity version. That server code is functional, but I would not be holding it up as an example of necessarily things to do. The interface and everything generally works, but it wasn't sort of a great architecture, and server side of things is something that I can make functional, but is very much not my area. So I don't want to be giving you bad advice there. And I think the setup is perfectly fine for sort of my needs, but it's one of those things where I don't know what I don't know, and I don't want to give you bad advice on how to be approaching the server side of things. But all of the code from this will be available. Thanks, folks. I hope you found the video interesting. If you have, click and like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're wanting to look at the code from this, I've made the code available up on GitHub. There is a link to that in the description below. So this code, you can use it in any of your own projects, commercial and non-commercial ones. As I said, though, this code, there are some dependencies that I haven't been able to include. So the code is not going to just directly be able to be used because of that. There are going to be modifications that you would need to make to be able to integrate this into something else. But I'll make the code available there. If you have any questions, chuck those in a comment below. And if you are looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description as well. But until next time, bye.